Father controlled every step of the family and said that I am no longer his daughter, cut me off from family money, everything, and then I was born into a world that carried the weight of history, expectation, and wealth. My father's family, the Harringtons, had roots deep in American high society, their influence stretching back to the early 1800s when my ancestors, English industrialists, migrated from London to New York. They were one of those families who had never known what it was like to live in scarcity. We were raised to believe that the Harrington name was synonymous with success, power, and impeccable reputation. Our family's estate, the Harrington Mansion, sprawled across several acres in the heart of Westchester County, just outside New York City. It was an imposing structure, a testament to the grandeur of old money, built in the late 19th century by my great-grandfather, Henry Harrington, a ruthless businessman who had made his fortune in railroads and steel. The mansion's limestone facade loomed over perfectly manicured lawns, guarded by wrought iron gates, as if to remind the world that the Harrington legacy was untouchable. But behind those pristine walls, the reality of our lives was far from the fairy tale others imagined. My father, Charles Harrington III, was a man whose ambitions consumed everything in his path, including his family. To the world, he was a brilliant financier, a man whose name was spoken alongside titans like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, the kind of man who made headlines on Wall Street and received invitations to exclusive gala dinners with politicians and dignitaries. But to us, me, my mother, and my brother, he was a tyrant, a man whose love for control overshadowed any shred of warmth or affection. My mother, Eleanor, had been chosen by my father for her beauty and lineage. She was the last of the Beaumonts, a once-esteemed family that had fallen on hard times after her parents were killed in a car accident when she was a teenager. Raised by her grandmother in the quiet remnants of an old Southern estate, she had been groomed to marry into wealth, and my father saw in her the perfect blend of grace and vulnerability. She was everything a Harrington bride should be: beautiful, elegant, and silent. I sometimes wondered if my mother had loved my father in those early days, or if she had simply been swept up by the power and grandeur of being a Harrington wife. By the time I was old enough to understand the dynamics of their marriage, I only saw the fear in her eyes. She was afraid of him, afraid of the world he had built, and afraid of what would happen if she stepped out of line. She lived in his shadow, just as my brother and I did. My older brother, James, was 2 years my senior, and we had always been close. There was an unspoken bond between us, forged through the shared experience of being raised in the suffocating environment our father created. From the outside, we were the perfect children, educated at the best private schools in New York, dressed in designer clothes, and surrounded by equally wealthy, entitled friends. We lived in a bubble, floating through a world where appearances were everything. But even as a child, I knew something was wrong. I saw the way other fathers hugged their children at school events or laughed with them at family gatherings. My father never did that. He never hugged us, never told us he was proud. Instead, he demanded excellence in every aspect of our lives: academics, behavior, social standing. To him, we were merely extensions of his own success, tools to further the Harrington legacy. James bore the brunt of my father's expectations. As the eldest son, he was groomed to follow in our father's footsteps, to one day take over the family's vast financial empire. From an early age, my father would drag James into his office, a dark, imposing room filled with heavy leather furniture and shelves lined with books on economics and business. I remember peeking through the door once when I was about 7, watching as my father drilled James on stock market strategies and investment principles. James was only 9, but my father spoke to him as if he were an adult, his voice cold and unforgiving. I, on the other hand, was largely ignored by my father unless I stepped out of line. Perhaps it was because I was a girl, or perhaps it was because I reminded him too much of my mother. I inherited her delicate features, her high cheekbones, her soft, wavy chestnut hair, and her pale, almost translucent skin. From a young age, people would comment on how much I looked like her, and though they meant it as a compliment, I soon realized that to my father, it was a curse. He would often look at me with disdain, as if my very presence was a reminder of my mother's fragility, something he despised. "Don't slouch, Isabel," He would bark during family dinners, his sharp blue eyes cutting through me. "You look weak when you slouch." I learned quickly that any show of weakness, any sign of vulnerability, was unacceptable in the Harrington household. But it wasn't just my posture that bothered him. My father had a particular hatred for my shyness, something I had struggled with since childhood. I hated being the center of attention, hated the endless parade of social events where I was expected to smile and make small talk with people I didn't know. It was exhausting, and no matter how hard I tried, I always felt like I was failing. My father, of course, noticed. "You'll never amount to anything if you keep hiding behind your mother's skirts," he told me once during a particularly uncomfortable dinner party. I was 14 at the time, and my shyness had become a source of constant frustration for him. I remember the shame that burned through me as he spoke, the way the other guests looked at me with a mixture of pity and disapproval. From that moment on, I became convinced that I was weak, unworthy of the Harrington name. My only solace came from my mother. She was the one who held me when I cried, the one who whispered words of comfort when my father's criticisms became too much to bear. But even she couldn't protect me from the world he had created for us. She was trapped in her own way, bound by the expectations of a society that valued power and wealth above all else. As I grew older, I became more aware of the world outside our gilded cage. I started to see the cracks in the facade of the Harrington name. Our friends, the children of other powerful families, weren't really friends at all. They were rivals, constantly measuring themselves against each other, constantly trying to outdo one another in wealth, status, and influence. I heard the whispers behind our backs, the snide comments about how we were nothing without our father, how we would crumble without his money to prop us up. It was during these years that the anger started to build inside me. Anger at my father for making me feel small, anger at my mother for being too afraid to stand up to him, and anger at the world for expecting us to play our roles without question. James felt it too, though he expressed it in different ways. He became more rebellious, sneaking out to parties, spending money recklessly, and getting into trouble with the law. My father would always bail him out, of course, but each time, the tension between them grew. By the time I turned 16, the Harrington family was a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, lit the fuse. As the years passed, James and I began to find our own paths that diverged not only from each other but from the rigid expectations our father had imposed on us. We were no longer the obedient children who had once cowered beneath his critical gaze. Instead, we became versions of ourselves that he couldn't fully control, and for the first time in my life, I felt something akin to independence. James was the first to change. For as long as I could remember, he had been the golden child, the one who was expected to carry the Harrington name into the next generation. My father had groomed him relentlessly, drilling him in the ways of business, finance, and networking. By the time James turned 18, it was as though he was a miniature version of our father, dressed in sharp suits, speaking in clipped, measured tones, attending exclusive parties with the sons and daughters of other powerful families. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. It began subtly. James started spending more time with friends that our father disapproved of, people who came from wealth but had no respect for it, the kind of men who flaunted their money recklessly, who saw the world as their playground because they had never been told otherwise. James would disappear for entire weekends, returning home disheveled and distracted, smelling of expensive cologne and cigarette smoke. My father noticed, of course. He always noticed. But instead of confronting James, he let his disapproval simmer silently, a cold anger that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. I, too, was changing, though my rebellion was quieter, more internal. I had always been the shy, obedient daughter, the one who never caused trouble, who lived in the background of James's larger-than-life presence. But as I grew older, I began to find solace in something that had nothing to do with my father's expectations: art. It started innocently enough. I had always liked to sketch in the margins of my school notebooks, doodling flowers and landscapes when I was supposed to be paying attention to my lessons. But by the time I reached my late teens, those sketches had evolved into something more. I began to paint, at first simple still lives and portraits, then more complex pieces, abstract swirls of color that seemed to capture emotions I couldn't put into words. Art became my escape, my refuge from the suffocating world my father had built for us. Of course, I had to keep it a secret. My father would have never approved of me wasting my time on something so frivolous, something that didn't contribute to the family's legacy. So I hid my paintings in the back of my closet, behind old clothes and school books. I only painted late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, the sound of my brush against the canvas the only noise in the room. It was in those moments, alone with my art, that I felt truly free. But freedom, it seemed, was fleeting. James's rebellion began to spiral out of control. What had once been weekend parties and harmless flirtations with danger turned into something much darker. He started gambling, not just for fun but for serious money, betting on high-stakes poker games with men who were far more dangerous than the spoiled socialites he had once run with. At first, he kept it a secret, but it didn't take long for the rumors to spread. In the circles we moved in, gossip traveled faster than light, and soon enough, everyone knew that James Harrington was in over his head. I remember the day the truth finally came out. It was a late summer evening, and we were gathered in the grand dining room of our estate for one of those formal family dinners that my father insisted on. The room was as elegant as ever. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft glow of the crystal chandelier, and the walls were adorned with oil portraits of our ancestors, their stern faces watching over us as if to remind us of the legacy we were bound to uphold. James sat across from me, his face pale and tense, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Our mother, as always, sat quietly at the other end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, avoiding my father's gaze. I could feel the tension in the air, a tension that had been building for weeks, and I knew something was about to happen. Halfway through dinner, my father put down his fork and knife, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at James, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke in that cold, measured tone that always sent a chill down my spine. "How much do you owe?" he asked. James flinched, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding my father's eyes. "Don't lie to me," my father said, his voice dangerously calm. "I know about the gambling. I know about the debts. I know everything." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears. I looked at James, willing him to deny it, to say something that would make it all go away. But he didn't. He just stared down at his plate, his face drained of color. My father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "How much do you owe?" "James," he repeated. James swallowed hard, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. $200,000, I gasped, unable to stop myself. $200,000. It was more money than most people made in a year, more money than I could even comprehend, and he had gambled it away. My father didn't react. He didn't yell, didn't slam his fists on the table. Instead, he just stared at James, his expression cold and indifferent. "You're a disgrace," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. James's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he just stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "I'm not asking for your help," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "I don't need you." My father raised an eyebrow, as if amused by the outburst. "Oh, you don't need me? Then how do you plan to pay off your debts, James? How do you plan to keep the loan sharks from coming after you?" For a moment, James didn't say anything. He just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I looked at my mother, hoping for some sign of comfort, some reassurance that everything would be okay. But she just sat there, staring at her plate, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. After James left, my father turned his attention to me. "And you, Isabel," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I hope you're not hiding any secrets of your own." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a brief moment, I thought he knew about my art, about the paintings I had hidden in my closet. But then he looked away, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, as if I were too insignificant to bother with. The days that followed were some of the darkest I can remember. James didn't come home, and my father made no effort to find him. It was as if he had disowned him, erased him from the family, just like that. My mother withdrew even further into herself, barely speaking, barely eating. And I felt more alone than ever. I tried to focus on my art, but even that no longer brought me the same comfort it once had. Every time I picked up a brush, I thought about James, about the mess he had gotten himself into, and the anger and frustration bubbled inside me, making it impossible to concentrate. I wanted to help him, but what could I do? I was just a girl, a shy, insecure girl who had spent her entire life hiding in the shadows. And then, one evening, everything changed. I was in my room, painting, as usual, when there was a knock on the door. It was my mother, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She sat down on the edge of my bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "James is in trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. I knew that. We all knew that. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I mean real trouble. He owes money to some very dangerous people, Isabel. They've threatened to hurt him if he doesn't pay them soon." My stomach twisted into knots. "What do you mean? How much does he owe now?" My mother looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. $500,000, she whispered. The Harrington family had always prided itself on being impenetrable, a fortress of wealth and status immune to scandal. But, like all fortresses built on fragile foundations, cracks were inevitable. And now, those cracks were widening. It was in the midst of the chaos surrounding James's spiraling debt that my own secret life came to light. I had been painting in secret for years, hiding my work from my father, who would have seen it as nothing more than a childish hobby. Art was an escape for me, a way to express everything I couldn't say, everything I was too afraid to admit. My father's control, my mother's fear, James's rebellion. All of it poured onto my canvases in vibrant colors and chaotic brushstrokes. It was my rebellion, quieter than James's, but no less significant. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, and mine was no different. It happened one afternoon in early spring, when a prestigious gallery in Manhattan held a private showing of new, up-and-coming artists. One of the pieces, a swirling abstract work of bold reds, purples, and golds, caught the attention of several influential people in attendance. Among them was a renowned art critic, known for his sharp eye and even sharper tongue. He praised the piece, calling it a stunning exploration of raw emotion and inner turmoil. And, in the weeks that followed, the painting gained more attention. I had submitted the piece under a pseudonym, hoping to keep my identity hidden, but the art world is small, and word travels fast. Within days, the gallery was abuzz with speculation about the mysterious artist behind the work. My father, ever watchful, caught wind of the rumors. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was nothing more than idle gossip. But as the attention grew, so did his curiosity. He sent someone, one of his numerous assistants, no doubt, to investigate, and it wasn't long before he discovered the truth. The artist everyone was talking about, the one creating a stir in Manhattan's elite circles, was his daughter. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was late evening, and I had just returned home from one of my secret visits to the gallery, where I had been invited to meet potential buyers for my work. As I stepped into the grand foyer of the mansion, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, and the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. I barely had time to process the uneasy feeling before my father appeared at the top of the staircase, his face like granite. "Isabel," he called down to me, his voice cold and commanding. "Come to my study. Now." My heart sank. There was no mistaking the tone in his voice. He knew. I followed him down the long corridor to his study, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The room, as always, was dark and imposing, filled with heavy mahogany furniture and lined with shelves of leather-bound books. My father stood behind his massive desk, his hands resting on the edge, his knuckles white. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. I sat, my hands trembling in my lap, waiting for the storm to break. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain it to him? How could I make him understand that art was the only thing that had ever made me feel alive, the only thing that had given me a sense of purpose? "You've made a mockery of this family," he continued, his voice rising. "A Harrington does not expose their weaknesses for the world to see. Do you have any idea how this reflects on me? On our name?" "It's not about you," I blurted out, surprising even myself with the boldness of the statement. "It's about me. It's my work, my life." My father's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Your life?" he spat. "You don't have a life. You're a Harrington. Your life belongs to this family, to this legacy. And what you've done, this painting nonsense, is a disgrace." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me, a small flame of defiance flickering to life. "I'm not ashamed of my work," I said quietly, but firmly. "I'm proud of it." For a moment, my father said nothing, his cold blue eyes locked on mine. Then, slowly, he straightened, his expression hardening. "You're no daughter of mine," he said, his voice low and venomous. "From this moment on, you're cut off. Financially, emotionally. You are nothing to me." The words stung, but in a strange way, they also set me free. I had spent my entire life trying to live up to his impossible expectations, trying to be the perfect Harrington daughter. And now, in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to anymore. He had disowned me, and while part of me was devastated, another part felt relieved. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked out of the room without another word. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for forgiveness. I simply left, leaving behind the weight of my father's control. But my rebellion was only one part of the storm that was tearing our family apart. James's situation had become even more dire. His debts had ballooned to over $500,000, and the people he owed weren't the kind to send polite reminders. Loan sharks had begun circling, making threats, leaving ominous messages on his phone. They weren't just after him, they were coming after our family. I found out the full extent of the danger one night when James came home, looking haggard and desperate. His once pristine suits were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes bloodshot. He had the look of a man on the edge, a man who had nowhere left to turn. "They're coming for me, Isabel," he said, his voice shaking. "They've given me an ultimatum. Pay them back or—" He didn't have to finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. We sat in the dimly lit sitting room, the weight of his words pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to help him, but what could I do? I had no money of my own. My father controlled everything, and he had already made it clear that James was on his own. Our mother, who had always been our last line of defense, was in no condition to help. The pressure of our crumbling family had finally broken her. She had retreated into silence, locking herself in her room for days at a time, refusing to see anyone. The once vibrant woman who had quietly supported us for years was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. I tried to reach her, to talk to her, but it was as if she had disappeared inside herself, unable to cope with the wreckage of our lives. And then came the final blow. One evening, James and my father had the confrontation we had all been dreading. It was inevitable, really, like a train wreck we could all see coming but were powerless to stop. I wasn't there when it happened. I only heard the shouting from the other side of the house. By the time I arrived, it was over. My father stood in the center of the grand hallway, his face twisted in fury, while James stormed toward the front door, his face a mask of rage and despair. "Get out," my father roared. "You're no longer my son. You're a disgrace, a failure. You've ruined everything." James didn't respond. He just kept walking, his footsteps echoing through the marble-floored hallway. And then, without a word, he was gone. My father turned to me, his face contorted with anger and grief. "This is what happens," he said, his voice shaking. "This is what happens when you defy me. This family is falling apart because of you too." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that it was his control, his need for power that had destroyed us, not our rebellion. But I couldn't. I was too afraid, too broken. That night, the Harrington family was irreparably shattered. James was gone, disowned, and our mother had retreated so far into herself that she might as well have been gone too. My father, in his quest for control, had destroyed the very thing he had claimed to protect, our family. And I was left standing in the wreckage, torn between my loyalty to my brother and the fear of facing my father's wrath once again. The atmosphere in the Harrington household grew colder by the day. My father, always calculating, had found a new way to regain control, and this time, his focus was squarely on me. After disowning James and isolating my mother in her own grief, I had become the last piece on his chessboard, the final chance to extend his power and cement his legacy. It started subtly, with hints dropped during dinner or offhand remarks about my future. He would mention the names of powerful men in his circle, business magnates and politicians, all of them older, all of them wealthier than anyone I had ever met. It was clear that my father had already begun his search for a suitable husband, someone who could strengthen the Harrington name, someone who could be manipulated into supporting my father's ambitions. At first, I thought it was just another one of his attempts to control my life, something I could ignore. But then he became more direct. One evening, as we sat in the cavernous dining room, he announced it casually, as though he were discussing the weather. "I've made arrangements for you to meet Arthur Davenport next week," he said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. Arthur Davenport was one of my father's most powerful business associates, a man nearly 30 years my senior with a reputation for ruthless deals and cutthroat tactics. He was as cold and calculating as my father, and the thought of being tied to him made my skin crawl. "I'm not meeting Arthur Davenport," I said, my voice trembling slightly but firm. My father looked up from his plate, his eyes narrowing. "You will meet him, Isabel. This isn't up for discussion." "I'm not a pawn in your business deals," I replied, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "I won't marry someone just to satisfy your ambitions." His gaze hardened, and for a moment, I saw the full force of his fury bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't get to make that decision. I've allowed you far too much freedom already, and look where it's gotten us. Your brother disgraced, your mother a wreck. This family needs stability, and I'm going to make sure it gets it." My heart raced as I met his gaze, defiance rising in me. "I'm not marrying Arthur Davenport. I'm not marrying anyone you choose for me." His face darkened, and he set his knife and fork down with a slow, deliberate motion. "You seem to forget, Isabel, that everything you have comes from me. Your clothes, your art supplies, this roof over your head. It's all mine. If you refuse to do as I say, I will cut you off just as I did James." The threat hung in the air like a blade, but instead of the fear I expected to feel, something else stirred inside me, a sense of resolve, of freedom. I had already been disowned in spirit the moment he dismissed my art as a disgrace. His threats no longer had the power they once did. "Then cut me off," I said quietly. "I don't need your money. I have my art, and I have people who believe in me." For a moment, he simply stared at me, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He had never expected defiance from me, his quiet, obedient daughter. But then his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You have your art, do you?" he sneered. "We'll see how far that gets you when no one will buy your paintings. I have enough influence to make sure you're blacklisted from every gallery in this city." His words stung, but I didn't flinch. "Do what you want," I said, standing up from the table. "I'll find a way. I don't need you." I walked out of the dining room, my heart pounding in my chest, but for the first time in my life, I felt free. My father's power over me had finally broken, and I knew there was no going back. I would make my own way, no matter what it took. But as the tension between my father and me reached its breaking point, another storm was brewing, one far more dangerous than either of us could have anticipated. James returned, but he was no longer the brother I remembered. The carefree, rebellious young man who had once defied our father's control was gone, replaced by a broken, hardened version of himself. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed from sleepless nights and the weight of his mistakes. He had fallen too far into the world of gambling and debt, and now vengeance was the only thing keeping him alive. He came to me late one night, slipping into my room like a shadow. I hadn't seen him in weeks, not since the night my father had disowned him, but now he stood before me, his expression grim. "I have something you need to know," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "James, what's going on?" "I've uncovered things," he said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Things about Dad, about how he built this empire. It's not just business, Isabel. It's illegal. He's been laundering money through offshore accounts, paying off officials to cover up shady deals. Everything he has, everything we have, it's all built on corruption." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the enormity of what he was saying. "How do you know this?" "I've been digging, talking to people who know him, people he thought were loyal. I found documents, Isabel, proof of everything." My stomach twisted in knots. My father's empire, his entire legacy, had been built on lies and crime. And now James wanted to destroy it. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. James stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes blazing with a dangerous intensity. "I'm going to bring him down. I'm going to expose everything and make sure he loses everything he's worked for." The thought of it made my heart race. Part of me wanted to see my father brought to justice for the way he had treated us, for the way he had manipulated and controlled us our entire lives. But another part of me was terrified of what would happen if James went through with it. "You can't just," I started, but James cut me off. "I can, and I will. He ruined me, Isabel. He destroyed our family. This is the only way to make him pay." I could see the desperation in his eyes, the need for revenge that had consumed him. There was no talking him out of it. He was too far gone. But my father wasn't a fool. He had always been one step ahead, and somehow, he had anticipated James's move. The trap was set. A week later, James's plan to expose our father's crimes went into motion. He had arranged a meeting with a journalist, someone who had been investigating the corruption in New York's elite circles. He was ready to hand over the documents, ready to destroy our father once and for all. But he never made it to the meeting. I don't know the exact details of what happened that night. All I know is that James disappeared. The authorities said it was an accident, a car crash late at night on a winding road just outside the city. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. My father's shadow loomed over everything. He had always been willing to do whatever it took to protect his empire, and this time was no different. James was gone, and with him, the truth. When I confronted my father about it, he didn't deny it. He just looked at me with that same cold, calculating gaze and said, "He made his choice. And now, he's paid the price." That was the moment I knew I had lost both my brother and any hope of saving our family. The Harrington name would live on, but it would be built on lies, betrayal, and blood. And I, the last Harrington, would be left to carry the weight of it all. The mansion felt different after James's death, like the soul of the house had withered along with him. The once immaculate rooms, filled with the echoes of our family's legacy, now seemed haunted by the ghosts of all that had gone wrong. There was a heaviness in the air that even the sprawling gardens outside couldn't dispel, as if the very walls were closing in. I had never felt so alone. My mother, who had long since retreated into silence, became a ghost of herself after James's death. She wandered the halls aimlessly, her once bright eyes vacant, her delicate hands trembling. She didn't speak, not even when I tried to reach her, to offer her some kind of comfort. It was as if she had decided to bury herself in the ruins of our broken family, unable to face the reality of what had happened. And then there was my father, the man at the center of it all. The man who had built his empire on lies, manipulation, and control. After James's death, he was colder than ever, his grief twisted into anger and pride. He refused to acknowledge that any of this was his fault. Instead, he doubled down, tightening his grip on what remained of his wealth and power, as if that could shield him from the truth. I knew what had happened to James wasn't an accident. There was too much at stake, too much my father had to protect. The timing was too perfect, too calculated. But I had no proof, and even if I did, Who would listen? My father's influence stretched far and wide, and I was just one person. One powerless daughter in a world where men like him ruled everything. But I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. The art world, which had once been my secret refuge, was now my only escape. Through my paintings, I had built connections with influential people, gallery owners, collectors, critics. They admired my work, not knowing the full story behind the artist, but intrigued by the raw emotion I poured into every piece. I had become someone in my own right, someone apart from the Harrington name, and it was through that network that I began to quietly unravel my father's empire. It started slowly. I leaked small bits of information to people I trusted, careful not to reveal too much too quickly. Documents, whispers of offshore accounts, rumors of shady deals. At first, it was just background noise in the world of New York's elite, the kind of gossip that people nodded at but didn't pay too much attention to. But as the pieces began to fit together, the full picture emerged. My father's carefully constructed empire was rotten at its core, built on years of corruption and deceit. He had paid off politicians, laundered money through shell companies, and manipulated markets to grow his fortune. The people I leaked this information to started to take notice, and soon enough, it reached the right hands, the hands of those who had the power to bring him down. I had no illusions about the consequences. Exposing my father would destroy everything, the Harrington name, the fortune, the legacy. But by this point, none of it mattered. The family had already been torn apart, and James was dead. All that was left was the truth, and I was determined to see it come to light. The final confrontation came in the very place where it had all begun, the Harrington mansion. It was a fitting end, I suppose, that the house that had been the symbol of my father's power would also be the place where it all came crashing down. I confronted him in his study, the same dark, imposing room where he had once disowned James, where he had tried to crush me with his threats. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stood before him, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me, but I refused to be the girl cowering under his control any longer. "I know what you did," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I know how you built this empire. I know about the illegal deals, the money laundering, all of it. And soon, so will everyone else." My father looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I saw a flicker of surprise in his expression, but it quickly hardened into the familiar mask of control. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know enough," I said, stepping closer. "And I have the documents to prove it. I've already sent them to the press. By this time tomorrow, the world will know who you really are." For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. It was fleeting, barely a flicker, but it was there. He knew that I wasn't bluffing. He knew that his empire was about to crumble. "You think this will fix anything?" he sneered, standing up from his desk, his voice rising. "You think exposing me will bring James back? You think it will undo everything that's happened?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze, "but it will stop you from destroying anyone else. You've ruined enough lives." He took a step toward me, his face twisted in fury. "You ungrateful little—" But I didn't let him finish. "This is over," I said, my voice strong and unwavering. "You don't control me anymore." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick between us. Then, without another word, my father sat back down, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. He didn't try to argue, didn't try to stop me. He knew it was over. I left the mansion that night, knowing I would never return. The press picked up the story within hours, and by the next morning, the Harrington name was all over the headlines. Business tycoon Charles Harrington exposed in major corruption scandal. Harrington empire crumbles amidst shocking revelations. It was everywhere, and my father's reputation was in ruins. But it didn't bring me any satisfaction. The truth had come out, but the cost had been too high. My brother was dead. My mother was lost to grief, and the family I had once known was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, I watched from the sidelines as the empire my father had built slowly crumbled. His assets were frozen, his business partners abandoned him, and he faced criminal charges that would likely see him spend the rest of his life behind bars. The mansion was sold, the artwork, the antiques, all the trappings of our once glorious family scattered to the wind. And me? I was free, but that freedom came at a price. I had destroyed the very thing that had defined my life, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. Standing outside the ruins of the Harrington estate, I looked up at the mansion one last time. It was just a house now, a hollow shell of what it had once been. The ghosts of my family, of our history, still lingered within those walls, but I no longer felt bound by them. I had reclaimed my identity, but I would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of my life. As I walked away, I knew that the past would never fully leave me. But for the first time, I was no longer trapped by it. I was free to be whoever I wanted to be. And that was all I had ever wanted. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.